welcome to this special mashup edition of Versed, the ASCAP podcast and ASCAP Screen Time. We are here at the virtual Sundance Film Festival with three extraordinary talents, Ron and Russell Mael, a.k.a. Sparks, and filmmaker Edgar Wright, who are celebrating the Sundance premiere of their wonderful music documentary, The Sparks Brothers. Since we are in different time zones, I'll say good morning to Ron and Russell and good evening, Edgar. So, this film is many things, but above all, it is a love letter, not only to these two incredible music creators, Ron and Russell, but to the pursuit of art itself. Edgar, I'd like to start with a question for you. You've had such great success as a filmmaker, yet this is your first documentary. What compelled you to tell Sparks' story?
I'd always been interested in making a documentary, and then I think sort of this came around organically because I felt like it would be easier for me to make a documentary than just boring my friends with stuff about Sparks over dinner. At a certain point when you're explaining your fandom or trying to explain like sort of the band or get people into it, I felt at a certain point it would be easier to make a documentary and go, here, this is everything you need to know about Sparks. I also felt as well that I felt that Ronald Russell and Sparks, I felt the most influential music artists to not have a documentary about them. And I'd say to friends, why hasn't somebody made a Sparks documentary? And it was at a Sparks gig in 2017. I was with director Phil Lord. And I said exactly that to him. And he said to me in the balcony, he said, you should do the movie. And I said, I will. So that's how it started.
It's such an incredible story. There are so many threads to it. Ron and Russell, you have a song called Collaborations Don't Work. Yet this film succeeds on many levels. What convinced you that Edgar was the right man for the job?
I mean, first of all, we've always loved his films. I mean, even before we ever met him, we were fans of his. But we have been approached by other people to do documentaries, and we've always felt that what we're doing musically kind of speaks louder than and kind of shows more of who we are than what a documentary could be. But then when Edgar approached us, it kind of all made sense. I mean, just what he does cinematically, there seemed to be some kind of connection just to the way his films were, and then obviously just his passion about the band. So we thought if there ever is going to be a time and a person, this is the right time and person. And we obviously have, it kind of went even beyond what our wildest dreams could have been for the resulting film. I mean, we're so pleased. The final point was just that Edgar really had respect for kind of all of our periods, that it wasn't a nostalgia piece, that he really felt that what we were doing, whether it's correct or not, but we tend to agree with it, that what we're doing now is as strong as we've ever done. And so the representation of some of festival appearances, just very recently in front of really young audiences, that was really important to us.
Right. Do you want to add to that, Russell?
Yeah, and also just doing a documentary, you're kind of exposing yourself to a big audience, and there's at least from our perspective, there's a fear to that exposing yourselves and how it will be treated. And so when Edgar had approached us about doing the documentary, we had discussions, and we were just on the same wavelength as to how much in certain areas would be touched upon, and what things were important and what things didn't need to be said in the documentary. And we were in agreement on all those sorts of things because we, like Ron had mentioned earlier, we do feel that our music says sort of so much about what we are, and that you kind of give away too much of sort of things that we thought weren't that relevant to our art. We preferred not to get into, but Edgar was so seeing that in the same sort of way, like, what areas to treat and what areas to just, that don't need to be spoken, in the documentary.
So, Edgar, Sparks's story spans decades, producing tons of archival material, and some of which is all of it is really a treasure trove for someone whose art form is visual. But there's so much of it. Did that make your job easier or harder?
It made it easier overall because, I mean, sometimes there'd be a thing where, I'd say to the editor, I'd say, oh, please we've got to use a bit of that performance. That's one of my favorite clips. I mean, it was great because I'd seen a lot of stuff. I think it's that thing where, like, I actually, before I decided to make the documentary, I'd found myself on a number of occasions, like, telling people about Sparks and then showing them YouTube clips. I mean, at a certain point, it was just a thing of like, wouldn't it be great to just have all these clips in one place? And then, so there was that. Like, there's an amazing amount of archive there, and there's a lot of things that we found that had never been seen, or even just, I think the thing that was really fun in the documentary was able to put together like this kind of Rashomon like style, different people telling stories, like, and even if people have slightly different versions of the facts, it all seems valid. Or, there's another part in the documentary where we see this gig from 1975 at Fairfield Halls in Croydon. And we, have interviews with Ron, Russell, Richard Coble, the roadie, who now is the Rolling Stones tour manager, and the stage invader herself, who was 14 at the time.
Oh, yeah.
And now we have an interview with her in her 50s, and for her to remember it so vividly and then watch the clip and tell us what she was thinking, that stuff is kind of extraordinary to me. So I was really pleased that we had such a wealth of like photos and archive, and then the actual people to talk about it, which is incredible to me. So, and sometimes I'd show clips to Ron and Russell. I'd show you clips, and you would have no recollection of having shot them at all. There was one like appearance on like sort of Sunday morning TV in the UK where you were making like a cooking show. And you're like, I have no recollection of doing this. So
No.
So there, speaking of all the people you got to speak in the film, it's a who's who of artists, musicians, writers, comedians, who all really flesh out the story from their different perspectives. When you started out, did you have any idea the depth of influence that Ron and Russell had on all these people? I mean, were there people that you weren't aware of that were fans or kind of came out of the woodwork when they heard about the project, or were
it was less that I think between myself and Ron and Russell and their manager Sue, we sort of like we certainly knew of people who had spoken about Sparks in the press before. And then I think beyond that, it wasn't like people came out of the woodwork. It was more beyond that there was sometimes that were people that I approached just with the assumption that they would be a Sparks fan. And, like people like Mike Myers maybe, or Patton Oswalt. It's literally that thing. It's almost like a sort of Freemason's handshake where you're sort of me and saying, you like Sparks, right? I love Sparks. So sometimes I just made the assumption, and usually I was correct, and those people are in the documentary. So even people that were not, I mean, the important thing to me was to show the breadth of influence, like, because I find it personally fascinating, say that the infamous appearance on Top of the Pops in 1974, you just think about all of the bands that were watching that. And even just in the documentary, you have the members of like the Sex Pistols, Joy Division, New Order, Depeche Mode, Duran Duran, and beyond. That's just like probably, it's one of those things where like everybody remembers that clip, and many of them went on to form bands inspired by what they'd seen. And so to sort of, I think that's the thing that kind of ended up being a great thing for me about the documentary, and maybe where it went even more ambitious than I was originally intending, was that by talking to Ron and Russell about their upbringing and what they were into, you kind of like, it's all the culture that's sucked in from films and TV and music. And then through Sparks, how then that kind of spreads to everybody else. I find that fascinating because it, it's just a sort of conduit for like culture is just incredible.
So history is littered with siblings who have not been able to sustain a creative partnership like you two have. Other than respecting each other's talents, what about your relationship has fostered your creativity all these years?
Well, I think there's just this sort of unspoken bond, this unspoken kind of mission that we're both on to just to do our music and to do it in a way that we think is really uncompromising. And I think that the two of us as brothers, it seems like so natural that that would be the case, that we're kind of surprised how other brothers acts, in fact, don't maybe see eye to eye as well as we do, and have had their issues, all the infamous ones that kind of have the exact opposite sort of relationship. So for us, it's kind of this real mission and goal to get across what it is that we're doing artistically as a band, and we kind of don't have board meetings where we go out and discuss what that mission is, but it's kind of just this thing, this unspoken goal that's there, and we don't have to say those things of what it is that we're trying to do. It's kind of just inherent in our whole way we work and operate.
The other thing is we're not competing with each other within the band. Our roles are really discrete, and I'm definitely not a lead singer, as you might have noticed. I mean, I think there's a genetic component to being a lead singer, like some roles in sports, and some people have that and some don't. And so I'm really accepting of the fact that I'm the keyboard guy over on the side, but that I'm able to kind of draw attention by kind of, in my own eyes, not really doing very much.
I think one of the fascinating subjects that is explored in the film is sort of this cultural dialogue between the United States and the UK and Europe. How over the years there's been kind of this back and forth of music and film and comedy from both sides of the pond that has sort of spurred the other, the artists on the other shores to kind of like, step up their game or to try to like pursue something that's happening over there. Do you want to speak to that sort of dynamic? Edgar, certainly as a British filmmaker, you've been inspired by American music and vice versa.
Yeah, I think it's a sort of one of the things that was really interesting for me doing the documentary was seeing kind of like Sparks are a very unique band, and yet like there are elements of the DNA that I hadn't previously kind of picked up on, that through talking to Ron Russell became a bit more clear. And one of the greatest things actually, before I started making it, is I asked Ron Russell to make me a playlist. I said, would you mind making me a playlist of music that you were listening to before the band started? And that list of songs was very interesting to me because it was very diverse. And then some things like it had never occurred to me when I saw it, like, I don't know, like the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band on the list. I was like, of course. So, and there were other things that were things that I was pleasantly surprised to see on there. Things I was, but it started to make sense. But I think I probably, in a similar way that I make movies, is I kind of like use sort of like a voracious kind of consumer of all sorts of culture. And then at a certain point when you're making art, it's like osmosis. And I don't want to speak for Ron Russell, but it feels a similar way in terms of like the music that you love, but also the other culture, as we talk about in the documentary, especially from film, how that seeps into the art.
As an artist, Edgar, as a filmmaker, what did you personally learn from Ron and Russell's story, having done such a deep dive into their career?
I mean, I think I was already aware of this. It was almost like the question that I wanted answering in a way, is that I guess, when I was growing up, I'd known Spark since I was 5 after seeing them on TV. And then until the internet came along where I could cross-reference things, I was always kind of quite pleasantly confused by like how this band were like still kind of not just still going, but also kind of like changing incarnations that sort of would come back and like sort of sound different and look younger. And it was very sort of confusing to me as like what was happening, and how was it that this kind of glam rock band and now got like a sort of a dancing glam in the 90s? What's happening? It just seems such an anomaly compared to everybody else's career path. And so I think making the documentary was just sort of analyzing that. And ultimately, I think the thing is just of total admiration for just persistence of vision. Just the idea that like to kind of be so sort of sure of what you're doing and what you want to do, that you can kind of see sort of far ahead to the idea of like, you know, being recognized in the future. And sort of like, you know, I know a lot of artists kind of maybe like sort of say like one day people will realize how great I am. But I think the sort of the cumulative effect of what Ron and Russell have done, I think at a sort of certain point it becomes undeniable. And I think certainly in the last like, you know, 15, 20 years of this kind of run of albums in this, you know, like sort of since, you know, Little Beethoven, I think for a lot of people kind of in the press and fans, it's just like, it's just got a sort of an undeniable career path that I don't think anybody else has. It sort of like sort of sparks this kind of really unusual in the most kind of bands of that era, either no longer going or just playing their greatest hits, or like not as good as they used to be. And the fact that Ron and Russell are still kind of considered like sort of a you know, a new band, you know, like sort of, I mean, not just a going concern, but like I feel like it's amazing to me to see in the music press kind of like them like sort of still in the zeitgeist, because they've never really rested on their own laurels. And I think that's just something to really be admired.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly their zeitgeist is change, and change is always occurring. So they will always be in the moment, and they will always be relevant. That's definitely one of the takeaways from the film. So to wrap this up, Ron and Russell, you know, to look at this beautiful documentary and to see your story told in such a artful and creative way, you know, what do you think this documentary has to teach, you know, emerging artists who hope to have a long career in this business?
Well, one is just to really, you know, just, you know, so many of the things sound so banal when you say them, because, you know, we get asked, you know, so how do I get started by, you know, new bands, or what do I do? And we don't know, you know, there are things that you control, and you control your sensibility and just doing what you feel you're really strong at doing, not showing people what you're not good at doing. And then there's just an element of luck as well. Like in the documentary, that Todd Rundgren is the only person that liked what we were doing before we got our first record deal, when we were submitted things. So if there hadn't been a Todd Rundgren, then, you know, all this would have disappeared. So you just have to have faith that just do what you're doing and make it really kind of unrelenting and undeniable within that sensibility, and just hope for the right opportunities to come along. And, you know, you like to think that when you do that, those opportunities are kind of there, but we realize how precarious that is, that if there isn't that one person along the way, that maybe things would have changed. So it's just basically persistence. And you know, after a while, people just say, I give up. They do exist, and I accept them. Even if I don't love them, I accept them.
You can also lie a lot. That sometimes gets you ahead too. Like, and it's in the documentary where, you know, we were at this one point in our career in the late 70s, and we didn't know what the next step that we wanted to take, but we wanted to do something radical. So we had this idea of working with Giorgio Moroder. And so we just thought that it would be really interesting to see what would happen if we placed what we were doing in the context of his sort of world of electronics and more danceable kind of music. So we, you know, we said, well, we don't know Giorgio Moroder, and so we did an interview with a journalist, and that's treated in the documentary, and just said, yeah, we're going to be working with Giorgio Moroder on our next album, because she asked what we're doing next, and she said, and she was a German journalist, and she said, oh, well, I didn't know that. I'm really great, really good friends with Giorgio. And we went, oh my God, now we're really in trouble. But telling that little white lie, then she said, well, if you'd like, I can introduce you to Giorgio. And we said, oh, that would be amazing. And so sometimes there's just, like Ron had mentioned, there's luck and a little bit, lie when you have to, and hopefully everything will work out.
But lie selectively.
Well, congratulations to all of you. This is such a wonderful film for fans of music, for fans of art, for fans of self-expression. It's pure joy, and I'm really, I can't wait to tell my friends about it. That was my first impression after finishing the film. It's like, I want to share this with so many people I know that will love this. And I think that's, part of your story is people just sharing what they love about you.
Well,
That's
thank you.
great.
We have so much gratitude, towards Edgar. I mean, when we saw the final result, it was kind of just beyond any kind of dream of what we thought it would be. And just, we're not good at expressing things speaking. It's more just through music. So, but there is that level of gratitude, we will, heartfelt.
I sent Ron and Russell as a Christmas present the poster from the movie of the Jacques Tati film that never got made. And I thought about it as I printed it. I said, "Oh, is this the best present or the worst present?" To remind them of what could have been.
All right, so Edgar, the last question.
Oh, he's got it. He's got it.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, there you go.
So
Not yet framed.
So Edgar, do you think this film will finally break this band?
It's in your hands, Edgar. It's in your hands.
The pitch for it was really that it's like a celebration for fans and an introduction for others. And I think when I was editing it, I was showing it to people who didn't really know Sparks. That was my kind of my litmus test. And the response from people who didn't know Sparks was just, they were sort of dumbfounded, because they were like, how did I miss this entire musical chapter? And also that it filled in a lot of building blocks of it. Maybe you, as Beck says in the documentary, there might be bands that are sort of playing music that basically goes back to Sparks without knowing it. So I think there's sort of the idea of sort of basically kind of the very detailed coloring in of a sort of a chapter in musical history that needs more of a shining a light on. So I hope that Sparks fans enjoy it, but also I guess ultimately I want to create more Sparks fans.
There would be a certain measure of Sparks fans that would be really depressed if it does break us, because a lot of the hardcore people really feel it's a special club, and that only they should know about Sparks. So if it kind of gets too far out of hand, there are going to be some very sad people. But
we're hoping for only minor success with the movie.
About that level.
One of my favorite quotes from the movie is that it's from Gary Stewart, who's sadly no longer with us, but something he says at the end. He says it it's not about ownership. He said, if I meet somebody who's just gone into Sparks, I don't say, "Oh, I've been here for 30 years. Where were you?" I say, "Welcome aboard, and here's more." And that's how I feel about Sparks. So this is my gift to people who are going to become Sparks fans.